Hi everyone, I'm delighted to introduce this week Emily Thomas, who is Professor of Philosophy at Durham University. She works on metaphysics right through from the 17th century to the 20th century, and her books are Absolute Time, Rifts in Early Modern British Metaphysics. She's also done a book called The Meaning of Travel. And she's edited two collections, one of which is Early Modern Women on Metaphysics. She has also recently done a wonderful shortish book about Victoria Welby, which is who she's speaking to us about today. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Alison. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I am going to give my slideshow shared screen, so you can tell me whether that's working. It's working. Good, excellent. Thanks all. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you today about Victoria Welby. So she is a Victorian philosopher, and she began working on metaphysics in 1880s Britain. So I am going to click through into first slide. This is Welby. She was really into the debates of her day. So she's reading about what's going on in science, what's going on in politics, ethics, all different areas of philosophy, technology, arts, like you name it, she was reading about it. And what I'll be doing today is giving you an overview of her views about the nature of reality. So as I read Welby, she thinks that our universe is comprised of motions. So material bodies are motions, minds are motions, and ultimately motion is the whole world. And that view underlies all of her other metaphysical positions. So I'm going to spend most of the talk talking about her views on motion, and then more briefly towards the end, I'm going to show how they feed into her views on other topics. The plan of the talk is as follows. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of her life and her works. I'm then going to spend the most time on section 3, so explaining her view that material bodies are motions. More briefly, I'm going to talk about her view that minds are motions, her idealism, and her panpsychism, all of which I think flow from her base metaphysic of motion. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of her life and some of her philosophical works. So Welby was born into the highest echelons of British aristocracy. Her mother, this is her here, it is Lady Emmeline Stuart Wortley, who became famous for travelling all over the world, and in fact took the young Victoria Welby with her. Lady Wortley died on a trip to the Ottoman Empire, and the young Victoria was actually with her on that trip. After her mother's death, Victoria Welby spent a couple of years at the court of Queen Victoria, who was in fact Welby's godmother. So already you're beginning to see some of the upper echelons of society. Having spent a couple of years at court, she marries Sir William Welby Gregory, and she retires to Denton Manor, Grantham. This is a photo, as apparently it was during the time shortly after Welby lived there. After her husband dies in 1898, she moves to London. From the 1860s until her death, Welby is at the heart of an extensive intellectual network, and I think it's difficult to overstate how extensive this was. So her archives, which do not contain her entire correspondence, just what survives of it, her archives contain letters with over 450 people. They are absolutely mammoth. And she uses this network partly to develop her own ideas. So she didn't publish lots of her philosophy, but you can see it in her letters, but also to bring people together. So she ended up hosting something like philosophical salons at her various houses, and she brought high-profile philosophers, scientists, other thinkers together. So she's really at the heart of lots of different intellectual networks. She was committed to significs, which is her term for theories of meaning, and she really wanted to promote significs within British thought. So to that end, she actually funded a prize in the journal Mind for the best essay on significs. So here is the winning essay. She was relatively well known within the philosophical world. So she was good friends with F.C.S. Schiller, among many other philosophers. That Schiller writes this wonderful spoof article about Welby, saying that Lady Welby, whose interest in clearing up intellectual fogs and purifying the philosophical atmosphere is well known, has offered a prize of £1,000 to any philosopher who can show that he, 1, knows what he means, and 2, knows what anyone else means. So the way that Schiller refers to her so familiarly in a spoof version of Mind, it shows that she must have been reasonably well known. So during her lifetime, Welby published several books and stacks more articles. She's probably best known for this book here, which is called What is Meaning? And infamously, this was once compared to Bertrand Russell's Principles of Mathematics in importance. The vast majority of Welby's publications concerns meaning and philosophy of language. What I'm going to be talking to you today is about her metaphysics, and she published very, very little of that. There are a couple of journal articles on time in Mind, but the vast majority of her metaphysics, you really got to dig out of the archives. So this is a photograph, for example, of one of her letters to George Remains, where she is talking about issues surrounding evolution and mind. Her handwriting is this bad, but thankfully she also typed some of her letters, so it's not all this difficult to decipher. But most of what I'm going to be telling you today is drawn from unpublished letters and texts. There is some evidence that Welby wanted to publish her metaphysics. So in her archives, there are some plans for unpublished books, which would have included chapters on topics like mind, motion, and evolution. So she was certainly thinking about it, but she didn't manage it in her lifetime. Okay, I'm going to move on to our big section, material bodies as motions. Welby makes a variety of quite puzzling claims about motion and the dynamic. So here's quite a good example. This is from a letter that she wrote around 1886. We know now what we never knew before, that beyond... Do you know, people, I'm actually struggling to see the slides because Zoom is obscuring part of them, which I'm realizing may actually be an issue. We'll just see how it goes. That beyond that everywhere there is motion, in every molecule as well as in every solar system. From another letter that she wrote a couple of years later, she's saying, I have had certain ideas nearly all my life, which I am now finding day by day to be an unexpected general correspondence with the present lines of scientific advance. These include the replacement of the static by the dynamic. So everywhere, instead of stuff or substance, we should read a complex of energy. The stuff is always secondary and provisional. The motion is always primary and permanent. She makes comments like this. Motion is primary, the dynamic is primary throughout all of her works, published and unpublished. And I think at first glance, they're extremely puzzling, even obscure. Like, what on earth does she mean by them? What I'm going to attempt to do is help us understand what she means by these statements. So, To do that, we're going to take a dive into the science of Welby's day, namely into vortex theories of matter. So from the 1860s, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, this is this guy here, he developed a kind of field theory, the vortex theory of matter. So earlier thinkers had suggested that waves like light travelled through something called the ether. And Thomson builds on this. So he argues that we should stop conceiving material atoms as kind of strong and rigid bits of matter. Instead, we should conceive them as vortex atoms, which he understands to be moving vortices, kind of whirls or whirlpools within the ether. So for Thomson, a material body is a vortex within the ether. This is quite commonly given an analogy with whirlpools within water. So the idea is that where you get a whirlpool, you get quite a sort of solid structure, even though it's in the middle of something very dynamic. That Thomson himself compared these vortex atoms to smoke rings. And in one of his papers, he talks about how he came to this realization when he was sitting in a room full of men smoking cigars, and they're all making the most amazing smoke rings. And he thought that the intricacy and the knots of the smoke rings could well represent the intricacy of all the different kinds of matter in the world. Thomson's vortex theory of matter, even though it's very poorly known today, became huge back in the late 19th century. So, I mean, one historian says that it was almost universally subscribed to at one point amongst physicists. It certainly was really, really popular. Now, some scientists who adopted vortex theory, they explicitly consider matter to be motions of the ether. I can't picture the ether. I don't really know what the ether looks like. So this is the best slide that we have of the ether. We just have to imagine the ether spanning the universe. And then these little whirls and so on are little bits of matter inside it. Other thinkers don't conceive vortex atoms as whirls of ether. They kind of just conceive them as whirls or motions, and then they leave open the nature of the underlying medium. So it might be ether or it might be something else. What we're going to do is look at 3 texts that defend vortex theories of matter. And these are all by scientists, but they're by scientists who are strongly leaning into philosophy. I mean, I think some of them are straightforwardly philosophers as well. So the very first one that we're going to look at is from G. Johnston Stoney. He was an Irish physicist, best known for the fact that he termed the he coined the term electron, as well as contributing to its discovery. So Stoney says that scientific inquiry finds motion pervading the material universe. There's motion everywhere, motions underlying every phenomenon, and it finds nothing existing outside the mind excepting motions. So a kind of motion first view of the universe. Next scientist is George Remains. So he is a Canadian-Scottish evolutionary biologist who did buckets of work on natural selection. He also claims all our knowledge of the external world is nothing more than a knowledge of motion, for all the forms of energy have now been proved to be but modes of motion, and even matter is known to us only as changes of motion. Third scientist is Karl Pearson. He's not really a scientist, he is a mathematician who does a heck of philosophy. And in his book, The Grammar of Science, he compares matter to a wave moving across an ocean. Right, so he says, for example, the wave consists of a particular form of motion which moves along the surface of the water. What if, after all, matter as the moving thing could be best expressed in conception by a form of motion moving? Pearson uses this diagram to show what he means. Right, so the idea is that the form of the wave is maintained across time, even though the water that makes up the wave sort of stays in the same place. So the wave is moving across the surface of the water, even though the molecules of water are kind of staying in the same place in the sea. So the idea is that a form of motion is moving rather than there being a thing that's moving. Welby engaged really closely with all three of these texts and many more besides, but with these texts in particular, she took extensive notes on them. She wrote to their authors about them. She writes about them to other people. Like she took these texts to be really, really important for her understanding of the world. And I think that when we return to Welby's seemingly puzzling statements about motion, they actually become a lot less puzzling when we read them in light of her engagement with these scientists. These scientists are saying that the world consists of motion, and Welby is saying exactly the same thing. And she takes her philosophical view to be straightforwardly sourced in the science of her day. So of course there is motion everywhere in every molecule in every solar system, because that's just what a material body is. It is just a motion. And as soon as you begin to think of material bodies in this way, then it makes sense that you're going to replace the static by the dynamic. You're going to replace substance with motion. So I think that is what she is getting at. There is an issue, which is for Welby, what is it that she thinks is moving? There's a stack of textual evidence that I'm not going to go into for lack of time. I don't think she thinks that material bodies are motions of ether. I think that she thinks they are motions of energy. Yeah, feel free to ask me about that in the Q&A, but it's just too complicated to go into here. Okay, so this is Welby's base metaphysic. Material bodies are motions. And I'm now going to talk about how I think this feeds into her other views. So let's start off by talking about minds. So as I read Welby, it's not just material bodies that are motions, it's everything in the world that are motions, including human minds. So here are a few of her remarks on the nature of the mind. So she tells us, I have always felt that I was no lump but a movement. Now that I know I am a furnace and not, so to express it, a box of fuel, I am content. A couple of years later, she tells us, mind has always been expressed in terms of matter, but now matter is dethroned by science. We must redefine it in terms of motion. So, I think really straightforwardly, Welby thinks that just as a material body is really a motion, so too a mind is really a motion. I'm going to move on to her idealism. So idealism is a family of positions which holds that in some sense reality is mental, or it's about mind or experience. Alison Stone and I have argued previously on the basis of other texts that Welby is an idealist, and I still think that's right. What I want to do here is talk about how I think there's a case to be made that Welby's idealism is in the same vein as that of vortex matter theorists, that is, of some of these scientists that we looked at before. So, as we saw before, these scientists are saying that matter is a sort of vortex, a motion, maybe within the ether, maybe within some other underlying medium. In holding that view, these scientists are already a fair distance away from traditional materialism. This is already very different from someone like Hobbes, say, who is saying that material bodies and minds are kind of based in like lumps or substances of matter. In saying that these things are really motions, that's already a really quite different view. And this allows them to ask a question. What is matter really? If matter is motions, then what is it a motion of? And for many of these scientists in the late 19th century, remember we're operating in a deeply religious context, the answer is thought or spirit. So when we talk about a material body as a vortex of ether or of something else, we're actually talking about it being a vortex of thought or spirit or consciousness. I'll give you a couple of examples. So G. Johnston Stoney, he claims that whilst we know not what motions are in themselves, there is considerable evidence that they are thought. Similarly, George Romanes says that wherever there is motion, there could be mind. We're going to come back to this, to some of their reasons shortly. But several of Welby's texts imply that she also conceives the universe in this kind of idealist way. So here's a letter that she wrote in 1886, where she says, all we know of matter is resistance. Now, as spirit is ultimate energy, it implies resistance. That is, the idea of matter lies within that of spirit. So she's arguing here that all that we know of matter is energy, and spirit is the ultimate energy. So this implies that spirit includes matter. Fundamentally, the universe is spirit, not matter. I think that when you put together these kinds of statements with Welby's view that motion is motions of energy, then I think if spirit is the ultimate energy, it certainly seems like Welby's motion is spirit. And this is very much in the same vein as the idealism that we're getting from Stoney and Romanes. Okay. Panpsychism. So, panpsychism, very popular today, including with my colleague, Philip Goff. It is effectively the view that in some sense, consciousness is everywhere. It's a really old view, but it was very popular in the 19th century as a result of theories about evolution, and I'll explain why. So, if we look at Charles Darwin, some of the views that he sets out in the 1859 Origin of Species, he argues very strongly that nature is continuous. So on the picture that you have here, you can see that all of the different animals and plants seem to have evolved in a continuous way, one from the other. Prior to the 19th century, this was sometimes expressed as the great chain of being. So it's the idea that everything that exists is somehow continuous with every other thing. As Darwin famously puts it, like nature, it makes no jumps. Now, this raises a question. What is the status of the human mind, of consciousness within this kind of evolutionary context? Because it might seem as though the human mind is quite a jump up from like some of the stuff you can see at the very top of the diagram here, from like a little amoeba, say. And that might suggest that there's not continuity within nature, that human minds are a kind of novelty, and that they break this continuous ladder of nature. To account for this, to maintain continuity within their systems, many evolutionists were pushed towards panpsychism. So if you think that there is consciousness of some kind everywhere throughout nature, then maybe we can say that human consciousness is just a matter, maybe it's a little bit higher than other things, but there's a change of degree, not a change in kind. So human consciousness is continuous with the other lower forms of consciousness throughout nature. this quite swiftly gets you to the view that there must be mind or consciousness of some kind everywhere. In other words, you've arrived at panpsychism. Consciousness is everywhere. Again, really hard to find a picture to represent panpsychism. So what we have here are vaguely supernatural looking mushrooms glowing in a forest. And this is how we will be representing panpsychism for the rest of the talk. Now, some of our vortex matter theorists are also panpsychists. And they are panpsychists for precisely these reasons. They are very worried about how to maintain continuity in the Darwinian universe. And so they are driven to panpsychism. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you think everything is really motion, then sure, in motion is really spirit, but why not just say that human minds are a very special kind of motion, but it's still a motion that's continuous with everything else. It doesn't just include Stoney and remains. It also includes these two. Right, so these are C.K. Clifford on the bottom left and C. Lloyd Morgan on the bottom right. And these two are perhaps the most famous panpsychists. Clifford's paper on panpsychism is really widely cited, taken to be like one of the sort of founding texts of the position. And they are also very worried about maintaining continuity within a Darwinian universe. We've already seen that Welby engages with the work of Stoney and remains. She also engages really closely with the work of Clifford and Lloyd Morgan. So Clifford's books she absolutely loves. She writes about them frequently. She became very good friends with Clifford's wife after Clifford had died. So she was very much in his world. And as for Lloyd Morgan, Welby actually wrote to him and has a gigantic correspondence spanning 10-15 years. The correspondence is so large. I mean, I think it would easily fill a book if you were to print the whole thing. Now, Welby, I say, also defends the continuity of evolution with regards to mind, and this powers her preference for panpsychism. So in a letter that she writes to Lloyd Morgan around 1890, she says, I often feel one could accept Professor Clifford's mind stuff, which is what he says is everywhere, if only instead of stuff he had said activity, a quiver of mind wave or mind beat. So in other words, as you would expect from Welby, given that her whole universe is about motion and dynamism, she'd be a lot happier with Clifford's panpsychism if he had talked about mind activity rather than mind stuff. But the basic point she accepts. Okay, now the way that panpsychism works for these theorists is that there is some continuity between, in Clifford's case, the mind stuff, the not quite mind, but almost mind that we find in the rest of the universe, and then the consciousness of our human minds. Perhaps it's something like, as the mind stuff becomes more complex, higher level minds appear. I have in my notes here, just for fun, I want to show you some images from Lord Armstrong on electricity. So this was a book that Welby really liked. These are images of electricity, of electric patterns. But Armstrong himself talks about how much they look like images of plants growing. And Armstrong himself also leans towards panpsychism, and I think this is one of the reasons why Welby likes it. It's as though even electricity itself is showing how it's really kind of bits of life and mind in there. Now, the difference between Welby and those other panpsychists that I mentioned is that she is also trying hard to figure out how human minds also seem to be quite novel within nature. So on the one hand, she wants to say, oh, sure, Darwinian evolution means everything's continuous with everything else. But she also thinks there's this sense in which our minds are special. So in this letter that she writes in 1903. It says, change of degree will issue in change of kind. And here lies the secret of matter and mind. They must not be confounded. They are two different, in note the scare quotes, products of motion. If we think about water, so you might think that when water reaches a low enough temperature, there isn't just a difference in degree between water and ice, but there is a difference in kind, that water is a fundamentally different kind of thing to ice. And I think that's the way that Welby is conceiving mind within the universe. So in a sense, everything is water, but also a change of degree, perhaps in degree of complexity or levels of energy, is going to issue in a change in kind. In the same way that a change in degree of temperature, you're going to get a change in kind of water, from ice to water. This struggle, where on the one hand she thinks that mind is continuous within nature, and on the other hand she thinks that human minds are novel, a kind of break within nature, is precisely the same struggle that Lloyd Morgan will also have across his career, and that he develops the theory of emergentism to solve. Now, Lloyd Morgan develops this theory after Welby had died, and I don't think that Welby is an emergentist, but I think that she is wrestling with the same issue. She's trying to figure out how mind can be continuous with nature, and yet human consciousness seems like a different thing. And that is exactly the same thing that Lloyd Morgan and the likes of Samuel Alexander also struggle with. Okay, ultimately, I see Welby's system as being something like this. So we have motion on the very bottom level, motion being sort of energy. You go one level up, you get bodies. One level further, you get living things. Higher levels, motion reaches a state of complexity that results in mind or consciousness. And I think that is how her world works. Yeah, so whole thing, Welby's universe, powered by motion, and that is everything. Thank you.